Okay, folks, so today we're going to take a look at the multiple choice section from the Global History Regents that was given in January 2024. All right, so let's get right into it. So questions 1 and 2 pertain to this source called the Memoirs of the Duc de Saint-Simon. And one thing I like to do first, because this doesn't really give me a clue about what this source is discussing, so I'm going to take a quick look at the questions because that might give me a hint. And I see in question number 1 here that it's asking me about King Louis XIV. So I'm thinking that this source is probably going to be about France in the decades before the French Revolution. So let's take a look together. He loved splendor, magnificence, and profusion in all things, and encouraged similar tastes in his court. The court is like the place where the king conducts his business inside the castle or palace. To spend money freely on equipages, meaning carriages, and buildings, on feasting and at cards was a sure way to gain his favor, perhaps to obtain the honor of a word from him. So if you wanted to have a chat with the king and get on his good side, you're going to have to spend some money. You're going to have to express yourself in a very wealthy sort of way, I guess you could say. Motives of policy had something to do with this. By making expensive habits the fashion and, for people in a certain position, a necessity, he compelled his courtiers to live beyond their income and gradually reduced them to depend on his bounty for the means of subsistence. Okay, so basically the king was encouraging the nobility and the people who were working for him inside the court to spend all their money on living this life of luxury because the king would not give them the time of day unless they did. And if they're spending all their money on living this life of luxury, they're going to now be dependent on their king, right? They're not going to have the money necessary to kind of challenge the king's authority. So this was done intently. This was the plague which, once introduced, became a scourge to the whole country, for it did not take long to spread to Paris, and thence to the armies and the provinces, so that a man of any position is now estimated entirely according to his expenditure on his table and other luxuries. Okay, so again, we're evaluating people based on how wealthy they look or how much money they spend. Okay, and this was done again intently to make sure that the nobility was dependent on the king so that they didn't have the finances to challenge his authority. This folly, sustained by pride and ostentation, had already produced widespread confusion. It threatens to end in nothing short of ruin and a general overthrow, right? So maybe this policy long term of just spending so much money is going to come back and haunt the French government in the years to come. So number 1, a historian, right, somebody who studies the past, would find this passage most useful for explaining King Louis XIV's attempt to do what? So number 1 is going to be our answer, control the elite class, right? Because the source discusses the nobility and the fact that we're going to use this policy of encouraging expenditures to kind of make them dependent on the king. Nobility is the elites. There's nothing in the source about establishing trust within the court. Okay, that would mean that the nobility would trust the king to do the right thing. I don't think we can infer that from the source, especially since at the bottom here, it says that the policy threatened to end in disaster, right? A general overthrow. So that doesn't sound to me like the nobility is trusting the king here. Provide necessities to be self-sufficient, right? If you're self-sufficient, you don't have to depend on anybody. Well, the whole point of the source is to make sure that the nobility was dependent on the king. So if they're dependent, they're certainly not going to be self-sufficient. So we cross off choice number 3. And it says here in choice 4, eliminate taxation on the poorer classes. This source has nothing to do with the poorer classes. Okay, so a historian cannot learn about poorer classes from this source. So we cross that one off as well. Okay, so again, choice number 1, always use process of elimination, because if you did, you could probably eliminate a couple of these really easily and get yourself down to maybe 1 or 2 potential answer choices. Let's take a look at question number 2. It says, which claim is best supported by the evidence in this passage? So choice 1 says, court visits led to the spread of disease in Paris. There's no evidence of disease spreading here in the source, so we're going to cross off choice number 1. Choice 2 says, Louis XIV supported religious toleration. Again, there's no evidence in the source of anything about religion, so we cross off number 2. Right, so now I'm down to choices 3 and 4. Get yourself down to 2 choices whenever you can. So number 3 says, King Louis XIV's excessive spending had negative consequences. Okay, there is evidence to support choice 3. So this is going to be our answer, right? The whole source is about excessive spending. And again, since it says at the bottom here that this policy threatens to kind of destroy France, that's an example, a specific example of a negative consequence. So 3 is going to be our answer. Let's look at choice 4 anyway, though, right? Absolutism in France promoted equality among the classes. Absolutism is this idea, right, that the king has total power over the government, right? There are no checks and balances. So the source does discuss the absolute power of the king, but there's nothing here about promoting equality between the social classes, right? I don't see the king and the nobility living in the same social class. The king is certainly a cut above everybody else in the source, right? So we're going to cross off choice number 4. So our best answer for number 2 is going to be choice 3. All right, so question number 3 corresponds to this very short source from Baron de Montesquieu. It's going to be a good idea that you guys know your Enlightenment philosophers and the things that they represented or the ideas that they put out to the world. Montesquieu in particular was an Enlightenment philosopher who believed in separation of powers. So very anti-absolutism, right? He did not want the king to have the power to make the laws, but also execute the laws and judge the laws, right? He thought that these should be separated into multiple branches of government, which is what the American Constitution is based on, right? So now that we discussed Montesquieu, this source should be pretty easy to understand, right? In every government, there are 3 sorts of power: the legislative, the executive in respect to things dependent on the law of nations, and the executive in regard to matters that depend on the civil law. Okay, so again, talking about different branches of government having different responsibilities. So that again, guys, is going to make choice 3 our answer for question number 3, the separation of powers. These other things are Enlightenment ideas. Consent of the governed more or less kind of goes with John Locke's ideas, right? The power of government should come from people giving permission to the government to take action, right? So it's another way of describing democracy, basically. Natural laws are the laws or rights that people are born with, right? So John Locke said that all people are born with life, liberty, and property. If we relate this to like the scientific revolution, a natural law would be like the law of gravity, something that's always constant in the universe. And social contract, though, that goes with Rousseau, right? Rousseau was a person who said that people collectively create a government and collectively decide which rights to protect him, which rights to kind of curb in order to make sure that everyone is protected to some extent in this new government. All right, so again, the only one that makes sense with Montesquieu here is separation of powers, though. Okay, but definitely know your Enlightenment ideas. Let's move on to questions 4 and 5. Okay, so this one is about the Ottomans. So I'm assuming that this source is going to be the Ottoman Empire. So let's take a look. By the late 18th century, so the 1700s, the West had a clear, if not wholly accurate perception of the Turks' strengths and weaknesses. The Turks meaning Turkish people, right? The Ottoman Empire was dominated by Turkish people. They're the ones that ran the government. They saw that the Ottoman army that gathered at Constantinople was only the most visible evidence for the vast resources that the Sultan could command. As the Venetians shrewdly noted, those are people from Italy, the security of the Turkish lands depends first on the abundance it has of all the necessities of life. So the Venetians are basically saying that this empire is successful because it has access to a lot of things, a lot of necessities, probably things like natural resources, right? From the hinterland, meaning the interior of Asia, Europe, and North Africa, flowed a torrent of goods, including wool, leather, furs, and cambric through Constantinople, food and spices from the Levant, that's like modern-day Palestine, textiles from Greece, iron from Anatolia, gold and precious stones from India and the Far East. The empire stood astride, meaning next to, all the traditional trade routes from east to west, and controlled a coastline of more than 3,000 miles, which encompassed some of the greatest ports of the Mediterranean, Alexandria and Tripoli, those are in North Africa. Even the great Christian centers like Ragusa, Genoa, and Venice, although past their peak, traded with the Ottomans more regularly than they fought with them, and were integrated into the Ottoman trade network. So, based on the passage, which claim is most plausible? So which one of these 4 things can I prove to be true using this source? Let's look at choice number 1 here. It says Europeans had no awareness of the Ottomans' strengths and weaknesses. Well, this can't be true because they're talking about how the Venetians knew how great and wonderful the Ottomans were. Venetians are Europeans. Okay, so it might be helpful to know that. Okay, choice 2 will be our answer, but let's take a look at choice 3. Traditional Islamic society was undermined by the Ottomans' advances in technology. The source doesn't discuss anything about traditional ideas and beliefs being undermined by new technologies. There's no new technologies in the source. So I can't prove that to be true using the source, right? Choice 4 says the Ottomans ruled through intimidation and fear. Nothing in the source about ruling with intimidation and fear. It's just about geography, access to trade, access to resources, access to products. So we're crossing off choice 4. So choice 2 will be our answer. The Ottomans maintained political and economic stability over a vast region. There's plenty of evidence for this in the source, right? The fact that the Ottomans maintained trade networks over Asia, Europe, and North Africa and got products from those places suggests a vast region over which the Ottomans had economic control. Other evidence is the fact that the Ottomans controlled a coastline of more than 3,000 miles. Okay, so these two pieces of evidence can help us prove that choice 2 is our best answer. Okay, question number 5. The author's purpose in writing this passage was to. Okay, when we see purpose, just like a CRQ question, they're basically asking, why did the author write this piece, right? What was the mission, if you will? So choice 1 says to demonstrate the advantages of state-sponsored religions. You should probably know what a religion is, right? But state-sponsored religion means the government itself is promoting one religion maybe over other ones, right? They have a goal of maybe converting people to one specific religion. There's nothing in the source about religion. Okay, so I can't make a claim that the author was trying to teach people about the advantages of religion. There's nothing here about religion. Can't do it, right? Look at choice 3. Describe the causes of the Ottomans' military success. There's nothing here about combat. There's nothing here about warfare. So I don't think the author is looking to describe military success using this source, right? That's not the goal of the author. Choice 4 says, illustrate the importance of technology to an empire's development. Again, if the source does not talk about the technology, I can't prove that one. I can't use that one, right? I can't say that the author's mission in writing the source was to show technology. Can't pick that because there's no technology here, right? So choice 2 is going to be our answer. Explain the impact of strategic location on the Ottoman Empire. I would say strategic location means you're kind of putting your empire in a position to be successful because you have access to maybe trade networks, or maybe you situate yourself in a place where there are maybe natural barriers to protect you from invasions from other places. There is evidence in the source to support that the Ottomans had a strategic location, right? What's the evidence, you might say? It's the fact that the empire stood astride, meaning next to all the traditional trade routes from east to west, meaning it's next to trade in the Mediterranean Sea. It's next to the traditional overland Silk Road trade networks that stretch from East Asia all the way to Europe, right? So that's smack dab in the middle of all these great things that's going to contribute to the prosperity of the Ottomans, making it a strategic location. So questions 6 and 7 correspond with the source by Simón Bolívar called Address to Congress of Angostura, written in 1819. Simón Bolívar should be a person that you remember from early in the school year as a person who liberated South America from Spanish rule, kind of playing up this idea of nationalism in an attempt to overthrow the Spanish. But let's take a look at this source. By casting a glance over the past, we shall see what is the basic element of the Republic of Venezuela. Venezuela is part of South America, part of the region that Simón Bolívar liberated. America, on becoming separated from the Spanish monarchy, found itself like the Roman Empire, when that enormous mass fell to pieces in the midst of the ancient world. So he's kind of comparing the Americas to what happened to Rome once Rome fell apart. Each dismembered portion formed, then, an independent nation in accordance with its situation or its interests, right? So in Western Europe, after Rome fell, you didn't have a large empire anymore. You just had separate little independent kingdoms. The difference being that those members established anew their former associations. So even though there were separate independent kingdoms in Europe, they still had connections between each other. A lot of times the royal families intermarried, right? A king of Spain might also be the king of, let's say, the Netherlands, for example. Okay, so there was kind of a connection between the independent kingdoms, even after the Roman Empire fell. We do not, so he's talking about South Americans now, we do not even preserve the vestiges of what once we were. We are not Europeans, we are not Indians, meaning Native Americans in this context, but an intermediate species between the Aborigines and the Spaniards. So he's saying we, meaning the people of South America, are not Spanish, right? Because there were mostly not born in Europe at this point, and they're not native people. This is a word he was using for indigenous people. Americans by birth and Europeans in right, we are placed in the dilemma of disputing with the natives our titles of possession and maintaining ourselves in the country where we were born against the opposition of the invaders. So these people that are born in South America with like a European background are in a tough spot because they're competing with Europe for power and independence over South America. And they're also competing with Native Americans for the control over land. So that's what he means by this intermediate group, someone caught in the middle of these two forces. Thus, ours is a most extraordinary and complicated case. Moreover, our part has always been purely a passive one. Our political existence has always been null, and we find ourselves in greater difficulties in attaining our liberty than we ever had when we lived on a plane lower than servitude, because we had been robbed not only of liberty, but also of an active and domestic tyranny. Allow me to explain this paradox. So the source does go on, but it stops here on the Regents exam. Okay, so this idea of political existence always been null, meaning the people born in South America to European parents, we call those people Creoles, right? In the like a encomienda system. Maybe you remember that from early in the school year or maybe ninth grade. So again, these people are born to Europeans. So you'd think they would have a lot of power over their society, but they really don't. The Europeans were controlling the show, right? So Simón Bolívar has a problem with this. So number 6 says, which historical document most influenced the government of Venezuela as described in this passage? So which one of these pieces of writing influenced the ideas that Simón Bolívar is talking about here in the source? So let's work our way through these together. So number 1 will be our answer, but let's go through the other ones. Choice 2 says Adam Smith's The Wealth of Nations. Okay, this is a work that was written during the Enlightenment where Adam Smith is basically arguing in favor of laissez-faire economics, right? Pure unfettered capitalism. This is not a source that has anything to do with capitalist ideas. So we're going to cross off choice number 2, right? Because capitalism did not influence the ideas of Simón Bolívar. Mary Wollstonecraft's A Vindication of the Rights of Woman. Mary Wollstonecraft was an Enlightenment philosopher as well, kind of taking the ideas of John Locke and saying, hey, these should pertain to women as well. This particular source is one where Mary Wollstonecraft was arguing that women should also have the right to education. This is not a source arguing for people having the right to education, and certainly not talking about women specifically. So I'm going to cross off choice number 3. The Napoleonic Code was the code of laws developed by Napoleon while he was creating his empire throughout Europe. And it's basically him bringing the principles, not all, but many of the principles of the French Revolution to people far and wide throughout Europe. So that doesn't really relate to this particular source. I'm going to cross off choice number 4. Let's talk about why choice 1, John Locke's 2 treatises of government, is correct. Remember, John Locke is the person from the Enlightenment who argued for natural rights, right? People are born with life, liberty, and property. John Locke is also the philosopher who said, if people are being denied their freedoms, you have the right to overthrow that government. There are passages or lines in this source that reflect that idea of John Locke, right? Maintaining ourselves in the country where we were born against the opposition of the invaders, right? So he's saying that they're defending their freedom against some kind of tyranny overseas, right? Defending themselves against the Spanish. So again, this idea of rebelling against someone who's viewed as denying you of your independence, denying you freedom, is an idea reflected in the source. It's an idea of John Locke. So we're going to choose number 1 as our best answer here, right? Also, too, this idea of an independent nation also reflects John Locke, right? Separation from the Spanish monarchy, right? Again, demands for independence and democracy. That goes with John Locke the best here. So we're going to choose choice 1 for number 6. Number 7. So with a question again about purpose, the question is asking, why did Simón Bolívar write this? What was his motive? So look at choice number 1. It's definitely not choice 1, right? To reestablish political connections with the mother country. The mother country is Spain. He doesn't want to be connected with Spain anymore, right? He wants to be separated from Spain. He wants independence. He wants to get rid of the invaders. So we cross off choice number 1. To promote economic diversity in South America. Nothing really here about economics. So if there's nothing here about economics, I can't make a claim that Simón Bolívar's mission here was to explain economic diversity. Can't choose that one. To uncover disloyal elements in Latin American society. I don't think he's identifying anyone who's being disloyal to him, so we cross off number 3. Number 4 is the best answer, and I know this is extremely difficult. To identify obstacles to national unity. Simón Bolívar was a nationalist leader, right? And a key effect of nationalistic attitudes is this idea that people need to identify common bonds and come together and unify into larger countries or larger states. Because if you do that, it makes the people who live there stronger as a group. And when Simón Bolívar liberated South America from Spain, one of his missions was to basically create a United States of South America. But this source is talking about the difficulties that the South American people had in coming together, right? He says, well, in Western Europe, after the fall of Rome, yeah, they were independent kingdoms, but they still had some connections. He's saying down in the middle and towards the bottom that it's too hard to have connections, right? Because there are many different types of people who live here, right? You've got Native Americans, you've got the Creoles, and he's saying basically that they had this dilemma of disputing with natives over the control of land. That does not suggest cooperation between groups, right? I'm sure Simón Bolívar would have hoped for some kind of cooperation with natives, but he also wanted to take control over a lot of land, right? So the fact that those two groups of people have different missions and are conflicting with each other suggests a problem with creating a united country, right? Because there are different people with different missions. So these are obstacles, meaning things that get in the way of unity inside the country. So we're going to choose number 4 here. This is a very, very difficult question. Let's move on to the next set. Okay, so this source is called Article 4, Proclamation from the Chinese Authorities, Chinese Repository, 1839. So when I see China and I see 1839, I'm thinking it's the era of imperialism. It's the era of the British trying to take control over parts of China, or at least improve their trading relationship with China, right? And it's also the time period of the Opium War. So with that in our heads, let's take a look at this source. For this reason, we make proclamation to all the gentry and elders, meaning upper class people here, the shopkeepers and inhabitants of the outer villages and hamlets along the coast for their full information. So basically, the government is issuing a statement to a lot of people living in China. Pay you all immediate obedience hereto, meaning do what we say here, right? Assemble yourselves together for consultation. Purchase arms and weapons. Join together the stoutest of your villagers, and thus be prepared to defend yourselves. Right, so I'm thinking if they're telling people to defend themselves and it's 1839, they're probably trying to defend themselves against the British during the Opium War, right? If any of the said foreigners be found going on shore to cause trouble, all and every of the people are permitted to fire upon them, to withstand and drive them back, or to make prisoners of them. So basically ordering Chinese people to shoot the foreigners if they set foot on Chinese soil. They assuredly will never be able, few in number, to oppose the many. Right? So they're saying with confidence here that China's huge, right? China has a lot of people. There's no way that the Europeans can win. Unfortunately for the Chinese, though, the Europeans did win the Opium War, right? Even when they land to take water from the springs, stop their progress. So don't even let the British have water. And let them not have it in their power to drink. But so long as the said foreigners do not go on shore, you must not presume to go in boats near to their vessels, causing in other ways disturbance, which will surely draw on you severe investigations. So don't even go on a boat out to the British ships to trade with them, because that's going to look suspicious. So let's take a look at questions 8 and 9 here. Which statement best describes the author's purpose in issuing this proclamation? This Regents loves to use the word purpose, right? So again, what's the author's mission? Well, let's take a look at choice number 1. To promote trade with foreigners? Absolutely not. Right? The source is saying if you trade with the foreigners, you're going to be investigated. You're going to get into trouble. It's definitely number 2. To encourage anti-Western resistance, right? The Westerners are the British that are doing the invading of China here, and they're basically telling the Chinese government is telling its people, you better resist, you better shoot the foreigners when they come on your soil. That sounds anti-Western to me, right? Let's look at 3 and 4 anyway, though. To begin modernization efforts, there's nothing here about trying to modernize. That'll come a little bit later in Chinese history. Right here, this is the time period where Chinese, lack of modernization is what got them into trouble, right? It's what allowed the British, even though the British are a smaller country, it allowed the British to win because the British had industrialization and modernization going on, right? Choice 4, to gain support for freshwater projects. There's nothing here about freshwater projects. I don't really get where they found that answer choice, right? But number 2 is going to be our best answer. Number 9, the actions described in this passage are most directly related to what? The retreat of the nationalists to Taiwan. It's not going to be our answer. That comes a lot later in Chinese history. That's the result of a Chinese civil war, right? The nationalists versus the communists. The communists under Mao Zedong chased the nationalists off the Chinese mainland, and they set up their own government in Taiwan, which still exists today. So that's not related to this source at all. It's much later in history. Invasion of Manchuria, it can't be that one. That's when the Japanese invaded China during World War II, or the couple of years before World War II. So that has nothing to do with this source. Outbreak of the Opium War. Yep, that's going to be our answer. We got the time period. We got China. We got the Europeans attacking the Chinese. And choice 4 is going to be wrong, right? Start of the Sino-Japanese War. That's the late 1800s when the Chinese and Japanese went to war and Japan got a sphere of influence inside of China. That has nothing to do with this because that, again, happens way, way later. The Opium War is directly connected because that's the right time period, right? So choice 3 is going to be our answer for number 9. Before we continue, if you could do me a favor and hit that like button and subscribe to this channel, I'd really appreciate it. It helps me get my content to more people and help them prepare for their Regents exams. Let's continue on. All right, so questions 10 and 11 correspond with this map. Finally, a break from the reading, right? It says dates on map indicate the year territory is lost by the Ottoman Empire. So another question set about the Ottomans. So in this map, we see just how big the Ottoman Empire was long ago, right? Controlling land in Southeastern Europe, North Africa, the Middle East, Southwest Asia, and the years indicate when those areas became independent. And by 1913, all that's left of the Ottoman Empire is the dark gray here, which is basically modern-day Palestine, Turkey itself, Syria, Iraq, right? Places like that. So it's much smaller than it was at the peak of the Ottoman Empire. So based on this map, what was the significant challenge faced by the Ottoman Empire between 1800 and 1913? This is tough because it's basically asking you to provide a reason for why the empire was collapsing, right? Rapid expansion led to high levels of inflation. Well, we cannot choose that based on the map. The map does not indicate anything about inflation happening inside this particular empire. So I can't choose number 1 here. That's not correct. Choice 3, let's take a look. Addition of territories in Africa required a large military presence. Well, it doesn't look like territories are being added. It looks like territories are being lost. So we're going to get rid of choice number 3 as well. Choice 4, acquiring lands in Eastern Europe led to religious uprisings. Well, I can't, that might be true, but I cannot prove that to be true using this map. So we're going to cross off number 4 here. So why is choice number 2 correct? Nationalistic movements led to territorial losses. Well, we see territorial losses in the answer choice, and the map shows territorial losses. So for that reason, I could choose number 2 as my answer. But this map also reflects nationalism happening, right? Look at all these places inside the Greek peninsula, also referred to as the Balkan Peninsula. Right? These are people who were largely Christian, who saw themselves as being different from the Ottomans, which was an empire governed by Turkish Muslims. So these groups of people broke away due to their nationalistic attitudes. They had pride in their own nation, and when you have pride in your own nation, you want to govern it yourself without the interference from other groups. And that led to independence movements in the Balkan Peninsula. And we see that here, right? These places became independent of Ottoman rule. So for those reasons, choice 2 is going to be our best answer. That's the only one that has something about territorial losses, which is what the map is about. So that's the best answer for number 10. Which claim about the Ottoman Empire is best supported by this map? Choice 1 is our answer, but we'll go through the others as well. It had access to important waterways and bodies of water. Do we have evidence to support that? You betcha, right? They had access to the Mediterranean Sea, controlling much of the land around the Mediterranean Sea, or much of the Mediterranean basin, if you will. It had access to the Red Sea, as we see down here, access to the Black Sea as well, even access to the Persian Gulf. So many different waterways and bodies of water. Let's look at choice number 2. It was carved from the Russian Federation. So that answer choice kind of implies that this empire was once part of Russia and it kind of broke free and did its own thing. Well, you can't choose that one because the Russian Federation or the Russian Empire is up there, right? That's a whole different region. So we're going to cross off number 2. It lacked natural resources and warm water ports. Well, we can't really tell anything about natural resources here, but we can reject this because they certainly had access to warm water ports, right? The Mediterranean Sea, all these places on the Mediterranean were warm water ports, meaning good for trade. The Red Sea, it's warm down here, right? It's the Middle East. So they certainly had those things. So we can't say that it lacked them. It controlled the entire coast of the Mediterranean? Nope. Much of it, but not all of it. Right? There are areas over here in the Mediterranean that were not in the Ottoman Empire, Italy being one of them, right? And Italy is not controlled by the Ottomans on this map. So I can't choose number 4. So number 1 is our best answer. Let's keep going. Okay, back to a long reading passage. So this one is written by Siegfried Sassoon. This is a guy who comes up on the Regents a lot. Usually he's presented with some kind of a poem that he's written. And this is called Finish with the War, A Soldier's Declaration, published in 1917. So when I see war and I see 1917, I know this is probably World War I because we know World War I happened between 1914 and 1918. So let's take a look at the source and see if my prediction came true. Siegfried Sassoon, a British soldier, sent the following letter to his commanding officer and refused to return to the trenches. Okay, so now I know it's World War I, right? Because the British are fighting in 1917, so they fought in World War I, and trench warfare is associated with World War I, right? The letter was eventually read in the House of Commons and was published in local newspapers and the Times of London. So this was published in England. I am making this statement as an act of willful defiance of military authority. So this soldier, Siegfried Sassoon, was upset with the people who were in charge of the military. Because I believe that war is being deliberately prolonged by those who have the power to end it. So he's saying the people in England could put the war to an end, but they're continuing it for some reason. Right? To prolong means to continue. I am a soldier convinced that I am acting on behalf of soldiers. I believe that this war, upon which I entered as a war of defense and liberation, has now become a war of aggression and conquest. So this soldier is saying that he thought he was joining a war to defend England, and now it looks like the English are just continuing World War I to basically suit their own needs, right? To acquire new land that they didn't have before. I believe that the purposes for which I and many fellow soldiers entered upon this war should have been so clearly stated as to have made it impossible to change them, and that, had this been done, the objects which actuated us would now be attainable by negotiation. So basically he's saying that the soldiers should have been told what the point of the war was. I have seen and endured the sufferings of the troops, and I can no longer be a party to prolong these sufferings for ends which I believe to be evil and unjust. So he's basically saying these new motivations for continuing World War I, acquiring more land, it's not right? The men should not be sacrificed to achieve this goal. On behalf of those who are suffering now, I make this protest against the deception which is being practiced on them. Also, I believe that I may help to destroy the callous complacence with which the majority of those at home regard the continuance of agonies which they do not share and which they have not sufficient imagination to realize. Okay, so he's basically trying to act on behalf of the soldiers who might not have the ability to defend themselves right now and protest against these decisions being made by the British government. So which statement best describes this author's point of view? So point of view is the author's position, right? The author's opinion. So choice 1 says, world leaders continue the war to promote their interests. Well, that sounds like the answer, right? They're continuing the war to acquire new lands, right? The source says, become a war of aggression and conquest. So that sounds like pursuing the British interests, right? Making Britain stronger. So choice 1's our best answer here. But let's look at the others. Soldiers never supported the war. That cannot be correct, right? Because this person joined the war voluntarily. He said he did that, right? It says in the source that he entered the war because he thought it was a war of defense and liberation, meaning freeing people from oppression. That sounds to me like he supported the war, at least initially. So we cross off number 2. Soldiers did not support efforts to negotiate an end to the war. No, he's saying that he wants to negotiate an end to the war. It says here it's attainable by negotiation. That's what he wants. So he is supporting efforts to negotiate. So we can't choose that the soldiers did not support that. Nationalism and patriotism increased as the war continued. Can't choose that one because it doesn't sound to me like he's being patriotic anymore, right? He's criticizing his own government. If you're patriotic, you're not doing that, right? You're supporting your government. So I wouldn't call him nationalistic or patriotic. So we cross off 4. Therefore, again, our best answer is choice number 1 for question number 12. Let's look at 13. What was the purpose of the author's letter? Back to purpose again, right? What was the mission of the author when he's writing this thing? To promote the goals of the British government? No, he's not promoting the goals of the government. He's criticizing the goals of the government in this source, right? To improve his status as a British soldier, I don't think he's doing this to suit his own interests, right? He's not looking to improve his status as a soldier. He's done with the war now, right? And he's speaking out against it. So I don't even think he's a soldier anymore. So we can't choose number 2. To suggest ways to recruit soldiers? Nope. The source says nothing about recruiting soldiers, right? He's telling soldiers to basically stop fighting. That's like the opposite of recruitment. So we can't choose 3. So number 4 is our best answer. To explain his act of civil disobedience against the war. How do I know this is true? Well, you have to know what civil disobedience means, right? Civil disobedience is another way of saying peaceful protest. Normally, we associate that phrase with like people like, I don't know, Gandhi, right, who used civil disobedience to liberate India from British rule. But the fact that he's publishing this anti-war letter is another form of peaceful protest. So civil disobedience, peaceful protest, boom. Number 4 for question number 13. Let's keep going. All right, so back to maps, which is good, right? No reading on this one. So questions 14 and 15 correspond with 2 maps of Africa. Map A says Colonialism in Africa, 1952. Map B says Africa in 1975. Colonialism is another word for imperialism, right? Maybe you remember that unit of study in which your teacher probably described this as the scramble for Africa. When European countries realized that there were so many natural resources to be found here, they all wanted a chunk of this. So the Berlin Conference was held in 1884 to decide basically the rules for colonization of Africa and to decide upon some boundaries. Remember, no African people were invited to this meeting. And they created new boundaries to suit the interests of the Europeans. But when they did that, they put together people that historically might have, maybe they didn't get along so well. Maybe you put together groups of Christians and Muslims and were expected to cooperate inside of a new place. Well, when the Europeans went home, sometimes these groups of people would now have conflict with each other, leading to periods of civil war, which is a problem that faced Africa in the years since these places became independent, right? So that's just some backstory on African imperialism and decolonization, if you will. So the source here, again, we talked about that already, but let's take a look at the questions. Which historical event was a significant factor in bringing about the conditions shown on map A? So which event created this situation in which these European countries had control over just about all of Africa? Not Ethiopia though, right? King Menelik II of Ethiopia was able to bring modern weapons here to help defend Ethiopia from the Italians. So they remained independent, but most of these other places got colonized by the Europeans. So which event contributed to that? It's not the Great Leap Forward. Okay, the Great Leap Forward is when Mao Zedong was the communist leader of China, and he was hoping to increase agriculture and industrialization in China in the 1960s. So that has nothing to do with a map of Africa. So cross off choice number 1. Choice 2, the Berlin Conference, is going to be our answer, like I discussed before. That was the meeting held in Europe to decide on the process by which Europeans will take this over. So that makes the most sense. Establishment of the League of Nations, that happens after World War I, right, which is an international peacekeeping organization. That has nothing to do with a map of Africa, right? And this doesn't represent peace. This represents aggression. So we cross off choice number 3. Formation of the World Trade Organization. The World Trade Organization is an international organization designed to basically promote more free trade between countries, to kind of eliminate trade barriers, things like tariffs. This has nothing to do with eliminating barriers to trade, right? This is just European colonization. So we cross off number 4. Berlin Conference is the best answer for number 14. Number 15, what best explains the differences in national boundaries shown on the 2 maps? Okay, so the national boundaries are certainly different between the 2, right? You've got European style national boundaries in a lot of these places, and now the Europeans are gone, right? So that's the difference in national boundaries. So what caused those things? New patterns of urbanization, people moving to cities doesn't cause this independence to happen, right? Opposition to modernization, opposing modernization would not lead to Africans becoming independent. That makes no sense because modernization helps with independence, right? Choice 3 says the spread of nationalist movements. That's going to be our answer for sure, right? Nationalism is going to increase, which means I want my country to be strong. I want my people to be independent. So if you want that, again, you don't want to be governed by somebody else. So nationalism will increase and contribute to independence movements in much of Africa, which would explain these new boundaries of independent African countries as compared to map A. Choice 4 says the end of the Cold War. That has nothing to do with changes in African boundaries. That might explain maybe the changes in European boundaries after the end of the Cold War, right? When places become independent of the Soviet Union. But again, that has nothing to do with Africa. That's more of a European thing. So we cross off number 4. Number 3 is our best answer. Let's keep going. Okay, so questions 16 and 17 pertain to these sources about Ghana. Ghana is a country in Africa that became independent. So it says in the source information below these stamps here, father of the nation, Ghanaian nationalism, internationalism, and the political iconography of Kwame Nkrumah, 1957 to 2010, African Studies Quarterly. Okay, so Kwame Nkrumah is the person associated with independence in Ghana. So we see his face on these stamps, right? We often see political leaders on US stamps. So this is not completely unheard of. So here's a source from Kwame Nkrumah from 1957. My cabinet have decided with my agreement to put my head on the coinage. So we're going to put Kwame Nkrumah's head on not just the stamps, but also the coins in the country. Because many of my people cannot read or write. They've got to be shown that they are really independent, and they can only be shown by signs. When they buy stamps, they will see my picture, an African like themselves, and they will say, look, here is our leader on the stamps. We are truly a free people. So let's look at the questions here. Which statement is best supported by the evidence included in these documents? I think this is a tough one in particular. Choice 1 says media and propaganda can be used to promote national goals. That is our answer. Let's talk about why, right? Media is like things in the news, things on the internet. Propaganda is basically the government putting out images to kind of convince people of an idea or to brainwash people with an idea if they're using it for some kind of negative purpose. And putting faces of leaders, right? Faces of leaders of places and the leaders looking all powerful and mighty, as we see here, right? This guy looks like a person who led an independence movement in his country, and we're kind of glorifying his rule and making him look great. That's an example of propaganda. It's not an evil example of propaganda, right? It's not something like we see maybe in Nazi Germany, but it's certainly propaganda nonetheless. So choice 1 is going to be our answer. Let's take a look at choice 2. Dictatorships lead to rebellions and nationalist struggles. There's nothing here about rebellions, right? It just says we're successful. We won independence. So let's make people aware of it. Government-sponsored agricultural programs are necessary. Can't choose that based on the sources, right? There's nothing here about agriculture. It's not supported by what we see evidence-wise. Choice 4, citizens should have freedom to travel and trade with anybody. That might be something that Kwame Nkrumah wanted, but it's not in the source, right? It's saying what is supported by the evidence in the sources. Can't choose it. But I do see, maybe not the best examples, but I do see examples of propaganda on these stamps. So choice 1 is our best answer for number 16. Number 17, these stamps were used by the government of Ghana as a way to promote what? They're not going to promote British imperialism, right? They're celebrating independence. They don't want the British to come back and take them over. Absolutely not. Cross off choice number 1. Environmental issues in Ghana. Doesn't look like the stamps are talking about environmental things, right? We're talking about liberty, freedom, the power of the military to win a conflict. Nothing here about the environment. Involvement in international groups. Nothing in the stamps about that. Right? They're just focusing on one country, not international efforts. So choice 4 is our answer from process of elimination. National pride in a largely illiterate population. So national pride, I see that here, right? Where's the evidence for illiterate? Right here. People cannot read or write. So we're going to use the stamps and coins to convince people that, yes, their country is now independent. If it wasn't independent, maybe the Queen of England's face would be on these stamps, right? Let's move on to questions 18 and 19. All right, so 18 and 19 refer to the source whittling him down. And we see a hand labeled US, United States, with a pair of scissors labeled airstrikes, cutting off the tentacles of Ho Chi Minh, who's trying to get a grip on South Vietnam. So I'm already thinking this is a source about the Vietnam War, right? If you remember anything about that, Ho Chi Minh was a person who led a nationalist movement in Vietnam. After the French were trying to take Vietnam back after World War II, an agreement was made in which they were going to split the country in half. North Vietnam would be communist, and South Vietnam would be a non-communist region supported by the United States. And Ho Chi Minh wanted to invade South Vietnam and reunify the country. That's really what the Vietnam War was about from a Vietnamese point of view. And the United States, with its containment policies, wanted to prevent that from happening, right? It didn't want to see communism spread to places where there wasn't communism already. So that's some of the backstory for this political cartoon. So which claim is best supported by the evidence depicted in the cartoon? Ho Chi Minh wanted to keep North Vietnam separated from South Vietnam. Can't choose that one, right? Because it looks like he's trying to control South Vietnam. If he's doing that, he doesn't want South Vietnam to be independent and separated. No, we cross that off. Choice 2, the U.S. used airstrikes to stop the spread of communism into South Vietnam. Yeah, that's our answer, right? The pair of scissors is cutting off his access to South Vietnam, right? And that's the airstrikes. So we choose 2 for number 18. But let's look at 3 and 4. Ho Chi Minh invited the U.S. to use airstrikes to end French colonization of Vietnam. There's no way that this person wanted the U.S. to do bombing campaigns in Vietnam. And again, it's not shown in the source that he wanted this to happen, right? Why would it looks like he's mad that they're doing this, not saying, hey, this is awesome, right? So we cross off choice 3. Choice 4 says, efforts by the U.S. to free South Vietnam from China were successful. You should know that the Vietnam War was not successful for the U.S., right? North Vietnam eventually did conquer the South and reunify the country under a communist government. So for that reason, this is wrong. But also, South Vietnam was not controlled by China. So we cross off choice number 4 for that reason as well, because China has nothing to do with South Vietnam. Number 19. The reach of Ho Chi Minh's tentacles in the cartoons suggest what? He was interested in developing a strong naval presence in the region. I don't think we can infer that based on the tentacles. I don't see him building any boats here, right? So we cross off number 1. His goal was to unify Vietnam. That's certainly what it looks like to me, right? He's trying to control all the territory. So that sounds like our answer, and it definitely is. But let's look at 3. He sought to cooperate with the U.S. to gain Chinese support. This makes no sense for so many reasons, right? Why would he be trying to cooperate when he's looking angry about the fact that the U.S. is using airstrikes? And why would cooperating with the U.S. gain him Chinese support? The Chinese are not on the side of the U.S., right? So cooperating with the U.S. isn't going to make China happy. That just doesn't make any sense. So we cross off choice number 3. Choice 4 says his political ambitions included conquering South Vietnam's neighbors. Well, I don't see him looking to do that in this particular source, right? He's just going after South Vietnam. There's no other countries on this map except South Vietnam. So we cross that off as well. Let's move on to the next question set. All right, so questions 20 and 21 correspond with a couple of pictures here. The day the wall came down, right? The wall, if it's 1989, and the fact that this one is labeled Berlin suggests that the Berlin Wall was coming down in 1989. And the Berlin Wall is associated with the Cold War time period, right? And the Cold War was a huge topic, basically a time period of competition between the US and the Soviet Union, right? You had competing military alliances, right? NATO on one side and the Warsaw Pact on the other. You also had a series of proxy wars where each side was trying to support other countries in their efforts to either spread communism or contain communism. So a whole bunch of stuff, right? The division of Germany into East and West, the division of Berlin into East and West, right, with the wall separating Berlin. So these photographs could best be used when studying the end of which conflict. Obviously, it's going to be the Cold War. That's going to be our answer for number 20, right? The Berlin Wall coming down has nothing to do with Korea. It has nothing to do with World War II because it was made after World War II. It was also made after the Korean War. And the Persian Gulf War, that happened after the Berlin Wall came down. Right, the Persian Gulf War happened in 1990, 1991, when the U.S. went to war in Iraq the first time to basically secure the flow of oil throughout the world because Saddam Hussein, the dictator of Iraq, invaded Kuwait and took over a lot of oil fields. Again, nothing to do with the Berlin Wall. So when the Berlin Wall came down, that was kind of like a symbol for the end of the Cold War, an end of the time period in which the Soviet Union was restricting people's freedoms under communism. So the Cold War is now over once the Berlin Wall comes down, more or less. So choice 3 for number 20. 21. What was an immediate result of the actions shown in these photographs? So which thing happened like next in the historical timeline, I guess, in this part of the world, right? The creation of a one-party political system? Definitely not. One-party political system means in a country, there's only one political party that's legal, right? And it's usually going to feature a dictatorship as well. Well, with the fall of the Berlin Wall and the end of the Cold War, you're going to have more democracy. You're going to have many more political parties. So if there are more parties and more democracy, we're not creating one-party political systems in East Germany anymore. So goodbye, choice number 1. The rise of fascist dictators? Definitely not. Okay, fascism in Europe is over by this point. Fascism in Europe is like Spain, Italy, and Germany in the 1920s, 30s, and early 40s. This is long after all that. So cross off number 2. An easing of tensions between Eastern and Western Europe. Yeah, that sounds good to me. Right? Because now, what's the easing tension? If you're living in East Berlin, if you're living in East Germany, you can now move freely to the Western side, right? That means less tension. That means less fear among the people, right? There was fear. If you tried to leave East Germany and go to the West and cross over the Berlin Wall, the fear was, and the tension was, that you might be killed doing that, right? If there's a fear of being killed for just moving from one place to another, that makes for a very tense situation. So when that wall comes down, tensions are eased. The formation of NATO. NATO is that military alliance between the US and the Western European countries, and also expanding to even Eastern European countries now. All right, so this happened long before the fall of the Berlin Wall. So we can't call this a result of the fall of the Berlin Wall. NATO was formed in like 1949. Okay, result is like effect. So since this happened before the fall of the wall, cross it off. Number 3 is our best answer for number 21. Okay, question number 22 is about this political cartoon called Unfavorable Exchange Rate, Washington Post 2011. And we see probably the Great Wall of China. Why do I think that? Because it's labeled China and it looks like the Great Wall. And behind the wall, it says we don't do imports, meaning China doesn't bring things into the country. Well, what's the thing that looks like it's coming into the country? Democracy. Okay, so when I see this, I'm thinking China in like the 1980s. So a time period in Chinese history when Deng Xiaoping was in charge, right? A person known for bringing economic freedom into China, right? The idea that you could start a business and earn a profit now, right? Elements of capitalism come to China under Deng Xiaoping. The idea of foreign investment is encouraged inside of China, which explains why most of our products are made there today, right? To take advantage of the inexpensive labor in that country. But democracy was not going to be something that was going to be allowed to enter China. Maybe you remember learning about the Tiananmen Square massacre in 1989, where Western educated Chinese students were protesting in the name of democracy, and Deng Xiaoping ordered that protest to be stopped, did not allow democracy to enter. So now that we have some backstory, let's look at number 22. What point of view is depicted in this cartoon? So what position is being shown here, right? Maybe the cartoonist's position on the matter. Choice 1 says China is not participating in the global trade market at this time. I really can't tell that based on the picture, right? Because they're just showing democracy as a thing, maybe trying to enter China, right? That's not a physical product being traded. There's no sales going on here. So I can't really tell that from the picture. So I'm going to get rid of choice number 1. China has attempted to prevent democratic ideas from entering the country. That's exactly what the cartoon is saying, right? By showing the Great Wall of China here, stopping ideas from entering, that's my evidence to suggest that choice 2 is the answer. But look at choice number 3. China viewed democracy as an attractive import? Certainly not. Not if they're blocking it, right? They're saying we don't do imports. We don't want democracy in the country. China was looking for excuses to strengthen the wall. I really can't tell that based on the source. I don't see China strengthening the wall here. That's the wall that was already there, right? That wall had been there since like the 1600s. So cross that off. The best answer is certainly going to be number 2. Okay, so question number 3 corresponds to this source called Globophobia from the Brookings Institution, 1998. Globophobia probably refers to fear of globalization, right? And globalization is this idea that the world is interconnected now more than ever before, right? We are connected using the internet. We are connected using airplanes and trains and cars, and businesses operate in multiple countries at the same time. Maybe to take advantage of the groups of people living in each country, right? Maybe you want educated workers in the US to design your software, but maybe you want inexpensive labor in some other part of the world to actually build your product. If you're a company like Apple, for example, right? So let's take a look at this source. One problem in making the case for open borders is that few of the winners recognize the extent of the gains they enjoy as a result of free trade. The losses suffered by displaced workers in the auto, apparel, or shoemaking industries are vividly portrayed on the nightly news, but few Americans realize that cars, clothes, and shoes are cheaper, better made, or more varied as a result of their country's openness to the rest of the world. So let's pause and try to summarize what this is about so far, right? So the source is basically saying that people kind of look down upon globalization because once the world is interconnected through trade, you can now buy your products from other countries. And other countries might be able to make products more cheaply. And if Americans are buying their things from overseas, it might put Americans out of work. It's talking about displaced workers in auto, apparel, or shoemaking, meaning workers in those industries are probably losing their jobs as a result of globalization. But the author is also saying that we don't realize that having more places to buy products from has led to competition, and competition means better quality goods, right? So that's why the author is saying that things are better now, right? Better made and cheaper as a result of things being manufactured around the world. But we don't really focus on that. We focus more on people losing their jobs. So it's kind of hard to make a case in favor of globalization when people are being put out of work, right? Workers who make products sold outside the US often fail to recognize how much their jobs and wages depend on America's willingness to import as well as its capacity to export, right? So think about like stores that sell products made in other countries. If we're not importing products from those countries, those stores can't exist. Could an Apple store exist without America's willingness to import? Probably not, right? So what happens to all those Apple employees is what the author is kind of saying there, right? People contributing to a pension fund, meaning like a retirement fund, right, seldom realize that their returns are boosted by the fund's ability to invest overseas, and almost no borrower understands that the cost of a mortgage or car loan is lower because of America's attractiveness to foreigners as a place to invest their money. So this part is confusing, but basically what the author is saying is that retirement accounts have more money in them because the people who run those accounts can invest in businesses in other countries because of an open global trading policy that America currently supports. All of these benefits help improve the standard of living for typical Americans, and they can be directly or indirectly traced to our openness, meaning free trade. They are nearly invisible to most citizens, however, certainly far less visible than the painful losses suffered by workers who lose their jobs when a factory is shut down, right? That's what gets the press. People being put out of work because Americans are now buying their products from other countries instead of from American factories, right? But the author is saying, yes, we might be losing some factory jobs, but there are all these other benefits to having open trade with other countries, that globalization is actually a good thing. Free trade is actually a good thing, according to the author. Everyone has their different position on this issue. An economist would find this passage most useful for what? An economist is someone who studies trade, right? So number one is our answer, supporting laissez-faire policies. So what is laissez-faire? Laissez-faire is governments not getting involved in trade, right? Not doing anything to limit trade, not trying to regulate trade. It's another way of saying like pure capitalism, I suppose, right? Free markets. So open trade without barriers is laissez-faire, right? Because the government is not taxing imports in an attempt to encourage people to buy products from American factories. This person is supporting the government not getting involved. Just let free trade happen because it brings more benefits than people realize. Choice one is our answer here. Justify protective tariffs? No, the author is anti-tariff, right? A tariff is a tax on imports. Like I said before, if we tax imports, the idea is it makes the import more expensive and it should encourage people to buy things from America or American companies. The author is saying that tariffs would be bad, right? He doesn't want tariffs. He wants free trade to happen. Organizing protests against labor abuses. I mean, I don't think an economist would find the source useful for that because there's nothing here about labor abuses in the source. Arguing for fewer environmental restrictions. It's not talked about in the source. If it's not talked about in the source, an economist won't find the passage useful for arguing this. It has to be there. This is there. It's not blatant. It doesn't say laissez-faire in the source, but if it's talking about free trade, open trade, no regulation of trade, that's laissez-faire, right? No regulation, hands off. So choice one is the answer for number 23. Let's move on to questions 24 and 25. So we've got a couple of statements here. HIV/AIDS still of global concern, so a problem all around the world. West Nile virus presents a major threat. Ebola kills 11,000 in West Africa. Zika virus spreads to 50 countries. Which claim is best supported by these 21st century headlines? So again, this is another effect of globalization, right? If we're all connected together, that means disease can spread to new places pretty quickly now, right? So choice number one here is our answer, right? Global interaction can help spread epidemic diseases. How is this supported by the headlines? Well, we've got a virus spreading to 50 different countries. That's a result of interaction, right? High income countries don't have to worry about contagious diseases. It's not reflected in this passage here. I don't see anything about high income countries, and I don't see people not having to worry. We know that HIV and AIDS are problems in the US, right? And that's a high income country, but we do have to worry about this. So we cross off number 2. Pollution is the cause of most contagious diseases. I can't tell that based on these headlines. There's nothing here about pollution causing these problems. Number 4 says epidemic diseases are a primary cause of economic inequality. I can't prove that using the headlines. If I can't prove it using the headlines, I can't do it. I can prove number 1 because it spread to 50 countries. Spread. So number 1 for 24. Number 25 says, which international response resulted from these 21st century headlines? So what is an effect, right? Effect, response, kind of the same thing. Which is an effect of this problem? The North Atlantic Treaty Organization responded with military force to stop the spread of disease. You can't stop disease with the power of the military, so you cross off number 1. Non-governmental organizations, or NGOs, withheld financial support until diseases were contained. That doesn't make any sense because you can't stop a disease by getting rid of financial support. You need financial support, right? You have to have the money to have doctors and hospitals and medication. So that just doesn't make any sense. You're not going to withhold money. The EU, or European Union, established refugee camps for victims. They did that, but not for disease victims, right? For maybe global conflict victims sometimes, right? Or maybe people looking to escape from the war between Russia and Ukraine. So this doesn't pertain to people being affected by disease. And also, too, this is European Union countries, right? I see a lot of Africa here. So for that reason, too, this is not going to be correct. So number 4 is going to be our answer. The World Health Organization and the international community worked to find causes and remedies for these epidemics. And that's kind of like a common trend, is that since World War II, international organizations are having to cooperate to solve some of these big global problems that we see today, whether it's the spread of disease or terrorism or the spread of nuclear weapons, right? Pollution, right? One country can't deal with these problems effectively. You need to coordinate between multiple countries. And the World Health Organization is one of those organizations that's an international organization where countries pool their resources and work together to try to slow the spread of disease. So number 4 is our best answer for number 25. Let's keep going. Okay, 3 more. We're almost there. This source says, Steedy and Wallace, the devil came on horseback, bearing witness to the genocide in Darfur, Public Affairs 2008. So Darfur is a part of West Sudan that has had a lot of conflict in recent years, in the last couple of decades. Like we said before, when the Berlin Conference happened and new boundaries were created, that led to the forming of countries consisting of groups of people that historically maybe didn't like each other so much. And when the European countries went home, that created an opportunity for those groups to become nationalistic and have conflict with each other, right? It led to civil wars in places like Sudan. And Darfur is one of those places in Sudan where there were people who didn't really love the government of Sudan. The government of Sudan being mostly dominated by Arabs, the people of Darfur, mostly not Arabs, and that led to ethnic and religious conflict in that part of the world. And when the people of Darfur wanted to separate from Sudan, or were suspected of trying to separate from Sudan, I should say, the Arab-based government of Sudan tried to stop that with what some people label as a genocide or a human rights violation. So let's take a look at the source. As soon as we refueled and resupplied, we headed back for another air patrol over the region. By this time, the entire villages of Hashaba and Kokono and 90% of Zaifa had been destroyed by fire. Every single nomad hut and every item of loot distributed by the Janjaweed, meaning the militia, the fighting force of Sudan, 3 hours earlier had been moved. All we could observe in any direction was white or gray or charcoal outlines of what had recently been places where people lived. I had never seen systematic destruction on this scale. So again, this represents that effort to eliminate the people of Darfur as a group because they were perceived as a threat by the government of Sudan, right? Definitely a human rights violation. So the question says, which provision, meaning law or rule, of the United Nations Universal Declaration of Human Rights was violated by the actions described in the passage? So if you don't know this, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights was issued in 1948, just after World War II, largely in response to the Holocaust and a lot of other wartime atrocities, maybe the Nanjing massacre as well, right? Because now we're trying to apply human rights on a global scale, and countries are promising now that since they're members of the United Nations, they're going to work to protect people's natural rights around the world. So which one of these things was violated in the passage? Well, even if you don't know all the rules of the Declaration of Human Rights, I think we can determine what was violated in this source. No person shall be held in slavery or servitude. I don't see any slavery happening in the source. Can't choose it. No one shall be subjected to arbitrary arrest, detention, or exile. No one's being arrested in the source. No one shall be forced to belong to an association. It's not in the source. So number 4 says, no one shall be arbitrarily deprived of his property. This is violated in the source, right? What does it say? Every single nomad hut and every item of loot distributed by the Janjaweed 3 hours earlier had been moved. So when we see the word loot, this refers to property being stolen by some kind of invasion force. So that's a violation of this particular principle. So number 4, 426. 2 more. Let's do it. Okay, this is a tough one for a variety of reasons. We've got a political cartoon here issued by the Washington Post in 1999, and it says lines in the sand. We've got a tank here labeled Milosevic. Okay, Slobodan Milosevic is a dictator, or was a dictator, of Serbia. Okay, Serbia was a province in the greater country that was once called Yugoslavia, which, if you don't remember, that was a country created after World War I. And the intent was to provide a country for Slavic people, which is what Slavs wanted initially. And since they didn't have their own country, it led to the assassination of the Archduke and World War I and all that stuff. By the time we get to the 1990s, groups of people living within Yugoslavia were starting to break free. Because what happened was, by creating Yugoslavia for Slavic people, yes, the Slavs were the majority group in Yugoslavia, but you had many different religious and ethnic minority groups living in Yugoslavia who were also nationalistic and wanted to rule themselves. And when places like Croatia and Bosnia declared independence in the early 1990s, the Serbians were upset about that because the Serbians kind of perceived Yugoslavia as their country, right? And the fact that they were losing territory was unacceptable. So Milosevic did some really sketchy things, right? Conducted human rights violations in Bosnia to try to eliminate the minority groups in Bosnia that were looking to separate Bosnia from the rest of Yugoslavia. So Serbian people turning against religious and ethnic minority groups living inside of Yugoslavia. So lines in the sand. So we see barbed wire here, it looks like, right? So it kind of implies that they're trying to stop the tank. And the sign says, final warning before the next warning. Very last notice, absolutely final notice, right? So it kind of appears to me that these barriers are not very effective, right? If you think about it from a practical standpoint, a tank can roll over barbed wire, no problem, right? This is not rubber here. These tires are not going to pop. So these barriers are not effective at stopping the big bully. So the big bully meaning Milosevic and the Serbians conducting human rights violations against minority groups in Yugoslavia, right? So the behavior criticized in this cartoon is most similar to which concept? The answer is appeasement. That's tough because usually you associate the word appeasement with World War II, right? When we had the Munich conference taking place in Germany, that's when Britain and France basically agreed to allow Hitler to take over part of Czechoslovakia. And then Hitler promised, I'm not going to take over anymore. Right? That was kind of like giving into a bully. Well, we're giving into a bully inside this political cartoon, right? We're not really stopping him from doing his horrible things. So that's going to be our answer. We're criticizing. It looks like the cartoonist is criticizing our efforts to stop Milosevic, or lack of efforts to stop Milosevic. So criticizing the appeasement of Milosevic. So 27 should be choice number 2. Let's talk about the other answer choices for 27 though, right? Choice 1 says alliances. Alliances, that's not being criticized in the cartoon. I don't see any alliances happening here. Non-alignment. This is the word that does not come up too often on the Regents, but this is when countries that became newly independent during the Cold War decided to not get caught up in the alliances. So deciding to not be a part of NATO, but also not be a part of the Warsaw Pact because they were weak, right? They're newly independent. They couldn't get caught up in a military conflict. So they decide to pursue their own path separate from the superpowers. That has nothing to do with this cartoon. Nuclear proliferation means the spread of nuclear technology. This cartoon has nothing to do with the spread of nuclear technology. So we're going to cross off number 4 for 27. And finally, number 28. Which organization directly helped to end the human rights violations shown in the cartoon? This is really tough, right? So what organization actually stopped Milosevic? You'd think it would be the United Nations, but it wasn't. Okay, one problem with the United Nations is that the Security Council, which is like probably the most important group of countries within the UN, if a country decides to not want the UN to take action, the UN does not take action. So there were countries who did not want to stop Milosevic that were part of the UN. So the UN was kind of powerless to stop the human rights violations. So who stopped the human rights violations? Well, it was NATO. The North Atlantic Treaty Organization countries bombed Serbian military installations to stop Serbia from doing human rights violations in both Bosnia and then later in Kosovo. And then later on, they're going to put Milosevic on trial for human rights violations. But unfortunately, during the trial, Milosevic died. So we couldn't find him guilty of human rights violations. Okay, so NATO is the organization that stopped Milosevic, not the United Nations. Fortunately, the UN is not on here, because if the UN and NATO were on here, that would make this extremely difficult, right? A trade organization is not going to stop conflict. Organization of African Unity. This was Kwame Nkrumah's effort to bring African countries together. That has nothing to do with conflict in Eastern Europe. OPEC. That has nothing to do with this either, right? This is Middle Eastern countries basically controlling the supply of oil and therefore the prices of oil. So for those reasons, right, NATO makes the most sense. That we know that NATO has the power of the military, so maybe force can stop force. So maybe just through common sense, we could choose number 3 for 28. All right, folks, so that does it for the multiple choice section from the January 2024 Global History Regents. I hope this review helped. If you could please, again, do me a favor, like this video, subscribe to the channel, I'd really appreciate it. And please go back too, check out my playlists for other Regents review content that I've made over the years. I've gone over Regents exams going back to 2019, the multiple choice sections, the CRQ sections, and even the enduring issues essays. So definitely use these resources to your advantage. Best of luck to you in your studies and good luck on your test.